This lecture will examine the region of Australia and Oceania through its environment and physical geography, population and settlement patterns, cultural diversity and cohesion, geopolitical framework, and economic and social development. More specifically, 1. Describe the geographic characteristics of the region known as Oceania. 2. Identify the major environmental issues problematic to Australia and Oceania, as well as the pathways towards solving those problems. 3. Explain how the Pacific Rim of Fire is linked to the landforms of Oceania. 4. Describe the different sources of energy used in Australia and New Zealand and how this influences the amount and kind of greenhouse gas emissions produced in each country. 5. Summarize the prehistoric peopling of the Pacific as well as the colonial exploration and settlement of Australia and Oceania. 6. Explain the changing migration patterns to and within post-war Australia and Oceania. 7. Describe the different pathways to independence taken by countries in Oceania. 8. Describe the historical and modern interactions between native peoples and Anglo-European migrants in Australia and Oceania. 9. Summarize why and how Oceania has become a contested region between global superpowers. 10. Describe the diverse economic geographies of Oceania. And 11. Explain the positive and negative interactions of Australia and Oceania with the global economy. Australia and Oceania is a vast region of islands dominated by water. Most of the islands are oceanic, in that they were formed by volcanic activity originating at the ocean floor. Oceania, which includes the subregions of Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, is a tropical realm of islands, coral reefs, and atolls. Australia, the only island continent in the world, is closely linked to New Zealand by their shared historical ties to Britain. However, New Zealand is usually considered part of Polynesia, which means many islands. Melanesia means dark islands and was named as such because early explorers considered the indigenous peoples to be darker skinned than those in Polynesia. Micronesia, the more culturally diverse region, means small islands. Micronesia lies north of Melanesia and west of Polynesia. More water than land, the Australia-Oceania region sprawls across the vast reaches of the western Pacific Ocean. Australia dominates the region both in its physical size and its economic and political clout. Along with New Zealand, Australia represents largely Europeanized settlements in the Pacific South. Elsewhere, however, the island subregions of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia contain large native populations that have mixed in varied ways with later European, Asian, and American arrivals. From dry subtropical deserts to wet tropical islands, the physical landscapes in this region are quite diverse. Not only is the region diverse, but Australia is quite diverse in itself as well. Australia is made up of a vast semi-arid interior called the outback. Arid and generally treeless, the vast lands of the Australian outback resemble some of the dry landscapes of the U.S. West. The photo at the top left is near Pilbara, Western Australia. Australia is also fringed by tropical environments in its far north and hilly mountainous topography in the east, west, and south. The Great Dividing Range is also another unique feature of Australia. This mountainous area is a dominant feature of eastern Australia, extending for over 2,300 miles from north to south. The photo on the top right is from the Thomson Valley in the state of Victoria. The Great Barrier Reef, as shown in the bottom left photo, stretches along the eastern Queensland coast. The famed Great Barrier Reef is one of the world's most spectacular examples of coral reef building. Threatened by varied forms of coastal pollution, much of the reef is now protected in a natural marine park. New Zealand, on the other hand, is dominated by rugged mountains, much like that of Japan. These picturesque mountains, as shown in the photo at the bottom right, are referred to locally as the Southern Alps, which rise in heights over 12,000 feet and are complete with narrow, ford-like valleys that indent much of the South Island's isolated western coast. The island realm in this region are considered either high islands or low islands. High islands were formed by volcanic activity in that most of them rise hundreds and thousands of feet above sea level and contain very fertile soils. The Hawaiian Islands are a good example of high islands, as well as Bora Bora, as shown in the picture. Bora Bora is considered the jewel of French Polynesia, which displays many of the classic features of Pacific high islands. As the island's central volcanic core retreats, surrounding coral reefs produce a mix of wave-washed, sandy shores and shallow lagoons. Low islands are formed from coral reefs, making them lower and flatter than high islands, and therefore have soils less fertile and support less varied plant life. Many Pacific low islands began as rugged volcanoes with fringing coral reefs, as shown in the atoll diagram, letter A. However, as the extinct volcano subsides and erodes away, the coral reef expands, becoming a larger barrier reef, shown in B. In addition, the term barrier reef comes from the hazards these features pose to navigation when approaching the island from sea. Finally, all that remains in a coral atoll surrounding a shallow lagoon, shown in C. Low islands dominate the countries of Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands. Latitude and altitude shape the climatic patterns of the region. Equatorial portions of the Pacific bask in all-year warmth and humidity, whereas the Australian interior is predictably dry and dominated by subtropical high pressure. Cool and moisture-bearing storms of the southern Pacific Ocean provide mid-latitude conditions across New Zealand and portions of Australia. More locally, mountain ranges dramatically raise precipitation totals in many highland zones. The Mediterranean climate of Australia's south and southwest produce the Mallee vegetation, which is scrubby eucalyptus woodland. Due to Australia's isolation, it contains a wide variety of unique plants and animals not found anywhere else. Best known are the country's marsupials, which are animals that raise their young in a pouch, such as the kangaroo, koala, wombat, and Tasmanian devil. The photo on the left shows a gray kangaroo, the largest member of the kangaroo family, of which there are 4 other species. A few exotic species have found their way onto this region, which have caused great problems for endemic or native species throughout the Australia and island realm. One example is the brown tree snake. The brown tree snake, which arrived in Guam accidentally in the 1950s, has now taken over a large part of the island's forest lands and killed off most of the native bird species. Because these snakes, which reach 10 feet in length, climb along electrical wires, they frequently cause power outages throughout Guam. Modern environmental problems belie the myth that the region is an earthly paradise. Tropical deforestation, extensive mining, and a long record of nuclear testing by colonial powers have brought several severe challenges to the region. Human settlements have also extensively modified the pattern of natural vegetation. Future environmental threats loom for low-lying Pacific islands as sea levels rise from climate change. In addition, desertification is a problem in southwestern Australia, mainly due to overgrazing from sheep and cattle. One of the most devastating environmental issues have been the natural resource extraction of phosphate on the island of Nauru. In the photo on the left, a Nauruan local points to the scarred landscape that remains after decades of phosphate mining by Australian companies. With no mineral riches left, the islanders have tried several different schemes for finding their place in the global economy. In addition, much of Oceania's tropical forest is being destroyed by logging. In the photo on the right, hardwood tree trunks await loading for transfer to Asian mills, where they will be made into furniture for growing markets of China. Even though this region is a low emitter of greenhouse gas pollutions, the effects of global warming are severe. Mountain glaciers in New Zealand are melting, and Australia suffers from frequent droughts and devastating wildfires. Warmer ocean waters have caused widespread bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef as microorganisms die and rising sea levels threaten low-lying nations. Some of the solutions include alternative energy sources. Among the island's countries, a significant difference occurs in power generation between low and high islands. Many of the low islands must generate all of their power from imported oil and coal. High islands, on the other hand, use topography and higher rainfall to their advantage by generating hydroelectric power. For example, to reduce its dependence on coal and oil, Fiji is increasing its hydroelectric capacity. The new dam, as shown in the photo on the left, was built with funding from China. Another example is Hawaii. Like many islands in Oceania, Hawaii relies heavily on imported oil and coal to meet its energy needs. To reduce these imports, the state passed the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative that has a goal of providing 70% of its energy needs from renewable energy by 2030. This wind farm is on South Point, Hawaii, and is in the process of being rebuilt with modern turbines. Video question number 1. Please pause the video and answer the following. Explain how high and low islands are formed in this region. In your own words, using the text as a guide, be thorough and specific in your answer. Present-day population patterns across the region reflect the combined and interactive influences of indigenous and European settlement. In countries such as New Zealand and Australia, as well as the Hawaiian Islands, Anglo-European migration has structured the distribution and concentration of contemporary populations. In contrast, elsewhere in Oceania, population geographies are determined by the local needs and experiences of native peoples. About 37 million people occupy this world region. Although Papua New Guinea and many Pacific islands feature mainly rural settlements, most residents of the region live in large urban areas of Australia and New Zealand. Sydney and Melbourne account for almost half of Australia's population, and most New Zealand residents live on the North Island, home to the cities of Auckland and Wellington. Australia, despite its size, has a very low population density overall. However, most of its population live within one of its large cities, especially Sydney or Melbourne. Although the region has extremely low population densities, one of the most densely populated Pacific island is Nauru, with over 503 people per square kilometer, who are forced to cluster together in quasi-urban settlements due to the massive phosphate mining efforts that has been made the rest of the island inhabitable. The table shows that most of the populations in this region are growing as inferred with the high total fertility rates and high young population, and high young population, and some of the net migration rates are extreme for outmigration. Like many developed countries, Australia has a very low natural growth, as shown by the forecast for 2025 on the left. In contrast, like many developing countries, the Solomon Islands forecast shows the classic pyramidal shape of a young and growing population, as shown in the pyramid on the right. Australia is in a possible population crisis. However, the kind of crisis is not clear. Either Australia has already too many people and has reached its rural carrying capacity, or it is too small and not growing fast enough. Because the country has a huge area of arid and semi-arid land, it forces most of its population to live along the coast. Proponents of the first want responsible population policies that restrict population size, including tough immigration policies. On the other hand, proponents of the latter believe that the low birth rates will create a declining population unless migration is encouraged. No matter which side, many find it difficult to believe that Australia is already overpopulated in a country basically the size of the United States, yet with a population total only slightly larger than that of Greater Los Angeles. The photo is of a crowded area at a horse race outside of Melbourne. It is believed that the earliest settlers of Australia, the indigenous Aborigines, were presumed to have settled approximately 60,000 years ago, coming from Southeast Asia region, and they came most likely in some kind of watercraft. But since these boats were not capable of longer voyages, the islands in the eastern portion were not inhabited until much later. By 3,500 years ago, people mastered long-distance sailing and then moved eastward. The photo shows the typical voyaging canoe that was used to sail in the Pacific during the migration to the Polynesian islands. About 800 CE, they reached places like New Zealand and Hawaii. The indigenous people of New Zealand called Maori and are quite different from the Australian Aborigines. Recent settlement of Pacific Islands by Austronesian peoples from Southeast Asia shaped cultural patterns across the oceanic portions of the realm. Eastward migration through the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and the Cook Islands were followed by later movements to the north and south as shown in the map. By the 1600s, two notable European seafarers arrived, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman in 1642 and British Captain James Cook in the 1700s. Both found that the distant lands might be worthy of European development. European colonization began in Australia when the British needed a remote penal colony to which convicts could be exiled. Britain's Botany Bay near Sydney was the first penal colony in 1788. Later free settlers from Britain and Ireland also came and began to outnumber the convicts. Lastly, native Hawaiians lost their lands through American migration to the United States when the monarchy was overthrown in 1893, and formal political annexation occurred in 1898. Subsequently, Hawaii became a state in 1959. The settlement geography of Australia and Oceania offers an interesting mixture of local and global influences. The photo on the left shows downtown Sydney, Australia. In the foreground is this distinctive opera house that opened in 1973 and is now a World Heritage Site because of its unique architecture. The park on the left of the photo is the Royal Botanic Gardens. The photo at the top right shows Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Urban poverty and high crime afflict the city of Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea. The city slums, many built out on the water, reflect stresses of recent urban growth as rural residents immigrate from the even poorer nearby highlands. The photo on the bottom right is of downtown Melbourne, Australia. Metropolitan Melbourne lies along the Yarra River. Capital of Australian state of Victoria, Melbourne resembles many modern North American cities with its high-rise office buildings, entertainment districts, and downtown urban development. Most of rural Australia is too dry for farming or serves only marginally valuable agricultural land. Much of the interior therefore supports range-fed livestock, especially sheep and cattle. Croplands also vary across the region. To the south and west, productive irrigated agriculture has developed in places such as Murray River Basin, allowing for the production of orchard crops and vegetables. Viticulture, or grape cultivation, increasingly shapes the rural scene in places such as the Hunter Valley wine region, close to Sydney in New South Wales, where the oldest vineyards were planted in the early 19th century as shown in the photo on the left. Australia is the fourth largest wine exporter in the world. In rural Oceania, subsistence agriculture and plantation agriculture dominate the islands. Subsistent foods such as sweet potato, coconut palms, bananas, and other garden crops are often found in the same fields. A dominant crop throughout Oceania is taro, another starchy root crop. While taro is a traditional subsistent crop throughout Oceania, taro is also grown on plantations in Hawaii for commercial sales throughout the region. The photo on the right is a taro plantation on the island of Kauai. Video question number 2. Please pause the video and answer the following. Describe the population issue associated with Australia and choose a side. Do you believe Australia has too many people or not enough? Explain your position. In your own words, using the text as a guide, be thorough and specific in your answer. Like many other regions of the world, colonization had a serious impact on the cultural diversity that has shaped this region today. As the Europeans arrived, the native people of Australia, Aborigines, who inhabited the continent before European colonization, were decimated, and those who survived were relocated to the sparsely settled interior, where fewer Europeans competed for land. During the 20th century, most of the Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families and raised in government-run boarding schools to acculturate them into the white Australian society. Furthermore, the need for labor on the European plantations caused the migration of inexpensive workers from the Pacific Islands. These laborers were known as Kanakas. The Kanakas were spatially and socially segregated from their Anglo employers, but further diversified the cultural mix of Queensland's Sugar Coast. Historically, however, non-white migrations to the country were strictly limited by what is usually called the White Australian Policy. These governmental guidelines promoted European and North American immigration at the expense of other groups. This remained national policy until 1973. Today, the Aborigines continue to struggle for equal rights and decent living conditions. The family, shown in the photo on the left, lives in a traditional community near Alice Springs in the Northern Territory, where Aborigines make up 20% of the population. New Zealand offers a slightly different twist to the European colonization patterns that existed in Australia. The Maori are more numerically important and have survived European dominance, although lost their land in the process. Many Maori are committed to preserving their religion, traditional arts, and Polynesian culture. Wood carving is an active part of preserving Maori culture in New Zealand, as demonstrated by the carver in the photo in the center. At the Puai Cultural Center in Rotorua, North Island, New Zealand, the photo on the top right is a Maori warrior. Body ornamentation, including tattoos, were common in traditional Maori culture, particularly among the high-status warrior class. Before battle, the Maori warrior would perform a ceremonial dance called the haka that included fierce facial contortions with the tongue and eyes, as shown by this Maori dancer. Haka dances are now a common part of New Zealand's culture, particularly among sports teams. The photo at the bottom right is the New Zealand rugby team, the All Blacks, performing the Maori haka. Most Australians reflect the continent's most recent European-dominated migration history, but even these patterns have become more complex as a rising tide of Asian cultures become increasingly important. The map shows the dramatic changes in the source areas for immigrants to Australia after the White Australian Policy was abolished in 1973. While English is spoken by most residents, native peoples and their linguistic traditions remain an important cultural and political force in both Australia and New Zealand. Elsewhere, traditional Papuan and Austronesian languages dominate Oceania. The French colonial legacy also persists in some Pacific locations. Tremendous linguistic diversity has shaped the cultural geography of Melanesia, and more than 1,000 languages have been identified in Papua New Guinea alone, whereas the New Guinea highlands may hold some of the world's few remaining uncontacted peoples, which are cultural groups that have yet to be discovered by the Western world. Furthermore, several forms of Pidgin English can be found, especially in the Pacific Islands. With Pidgin, a largely English vocabulary is reworked and blended with local grammar to form a new language for intercultural communications. Today, Pidgin has become a globalized language of sorts in Oceania as trade and political ties develop between different native island groups. There are several gender-related key points to mention that complement our understanding of the cultural geography of Australia and Oceania. One is that both Australia and New Zealand were either early supporters of female suffrage, empowering women to vote in national elections as early as 1893. Both countries have since elected female prime ministers. Julia Gillard was the first female elected Prime Minister of Australia and served from 2010 to 2013. In the photo, she autographs a student's shirt at a cricket match between Sri Lanka and Australia. 2. Prior to European colonization, Maori women and men were equal in social status and power, with a very gender-neutral culture and in their language. Unfortunately, it was European influences that separated the genders in gender-specific norms that are still in practice today. And 3. Unlike the Maori, men and women, Aboriginals, had distinct, clear-cut gender roles, where certain tasks were separated between the two genders. Video question number 3. Please pause the video and answer the following. Compare and contrast the Maori of New Zealand and the Aborigines of Australia in both culture and gender roles. In your own words, using the text as a guide, be thorough and specific with your answer. Pacific geopolitics reflect a complex interplay of local, colonial era, and current global forces, resulting in a political geography that is still very much in the making today. Both Australia and New Zealand still maintain their political ties to Britain, and to the British Queen continues to be their head of state, even though both countries have entertained complete independence. In contrast, most of Oceania are independent microstates, but keep close economic ties to other countries such as the United States. Furthermore, the United States still has political rule over self-governing commonwealths of Guam and American Samoa. The residents of each are also U.S. citizens. However, New Zealand and France have yet to give up control over other islands. New Zealand still controls substantial territories in Polynesia, including the Cook Islands. European colonists took the same approach in this region as it did in North America, with the intent of exterminating the indigenous populations. Since that proved unsuccessful, they installed English land law, which expropriated native lands and converted them into private property held by Europeans. These past actions set the scene for legal, social, and ethnic struggles that continue still today in Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii. Both Australia and in New Zealand, the Aboriginal and Maori people have used the political process to gain more control over land and resources in their two countries. In Australia, the government established several Aboriginal reserves, such as the area surrounding the Uluru, also known as Ayers Rock, as shown in the photo at the bottom right. Ayers Rock is a large sandstone formation of great spiritual significance to the Ananjanu Aboriginal people who live in this part of Australia's Northern Territory. In addition, the government in 1993 passed the Native Title Bill, which compensated Aborigines for lands already given up and gave them the right to gain title to unclaimed lands they still occupy. The map shows the applications for native land claims in Australia filed by different Aboriginal groups as of 2013. Note that these are applications only, not government-approved claims. Nevertheless, the widespread extent of the claims shows why the topic is so contentious and controversial, especially with the cattle and sheep ranchers who control most of the outback. In New Zealand, Maori land claims have generated similar controversies in recent years, especially since the land in New Zealand carries a larger economic value and the Maori constitute a far larger proportion of the overall population. Recent protests include civil disobedience, ever-increasing land claims, and returning the name to Aotearoa, an indigenous name meaning land of the long white cloud. The issue surrounding Hawaii is basically over whether the annexation of the islands by the United States were legal and is still contested today. Extremists demand that the UN invalidate the 1898 annexation, thereby granting Native Hawaiians a return to complete international sovereignty. The photo at the top right shows thousands of red shirt supporters of Native Hawaiian sovereignty gathering to march along Waikiki Beach in Honolulu in the annual Justice for Hawaiians rally. Because of China's growing influence in Oceania, coupled with North Korea's continued hostility towards the West, the United States is increasingly its diplomatic and military presence in the South Pacific. The term Asian pivot is commonly used to describe the shift in America's foreign and military policy away from Iraq and Afghanistan and toward the Asian Pacific world. China, on the other hand, considers this a thinly veiled policy of containment, which is a policy of preventing an expansion of a hostile country or influence. Asia Pivot includes the establishment of numerous small military bases scattered around the Pacific, commonly referred to as the lily pad outposts. As part of the Asian Pivot, the United States reached an agreement with Australia to station up to 2,500 Marines on the country's north coast near Darwin. Although the U.S. denies that the Marines are part of a strategy to contain China and instead maintains Northern Australia is simply a good place to train troops, world pundits think otherwise. Lastly, the geopolitical goals behind this Asian pivot seem clear enough: to establish the United States as a major political and military player in Oceania. Video question number 4. Please pause the video and answer the following. Explain how European colonialism has affected native land rights in both Australia and New Zealand. In your own words, using the text as a guide, be specific and be thorough and specific in your answer. Australians and New Zealanders enjoy high levels of social welfare, but face some of the same challenges evident elsewhere in the developed world. They have the same high rates of cancer and heart disease as in the United States, and alcoholism is a continuing social problem, particularly in Australia. Considerable discrimination continues against Native peoples as they are not as well off. Many countries have invested heavily in health care and education services, whereas Oceania naturally has a healthier environment in which many diseases are non-existent on the islands. As with all other world regions, the Pacific realm contains economic situations of both wealth and poverty. Furthermore, large economic disparities exist between those specific countries with global trade ties and those small island nations lacking resources and external trade. Much of Australia's past economic wealth has been built on the cheap extraction and export of abundant raw materials. Mining's recent growth is primarily due to increased trade with China. As shown in the photo on the left, containers from Asia testify to the recent explosion of two-way trade between Australia and China. Raw materials, mainly iron ore, are exported to China, and consumer goods flow from China into Australia, making that country a key beneficiary of China's recent economic growth. In addition, expanding tourism industry is helping to diversify the economy. Many of the luxury hotels, as shown in the photo on the right, in Surfers Paradise section of the Gold Coast in Queensland, are owned by Japanese firms specializing in accommodations for Asian tourists. To promote more economic integration within the region, Australia and New Zealand signed the Closer Economic Relations Agreement, CER, in 1982, which successfully slashed trade barriers between the two countries. Varied economic activities shape the Pacific Island nations. One way of life is oriented around mining, as shown in the photo on the left. New Caledonia has a quarter of the world's nickel reserves, most of which are located in the area of the North Star nickel mine, the second largest nickel mine in the world. Mining is a mainstay of the New Caledonia economy, but fluctuations in the demand and price for nickel cause sporadic problems for the country. Even more worrisome is the fact that the fiscal future is not particularly bright because of dwindling reserves in the North Star mine. Many Polynesian island groups have been completely transformed by tourism. More recently, Guam has emerged as a favorite destination of Japanese and Korean tourists, especially those on their honeymoon. The photo on the right shows an Asian couple enjoying their honeymoon on the island of Guam. Lastly, many of the islands benefit from the international law that allows them economic control over resources and sovereign rights extending 200 miles beyond their coastline. This area is known as the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. In a global context, smaller nations of Oceania, such as Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and the Solomon Islands, benefit from their proximity to Australia and New Zealand, and whereas more than half of Fiji's imports come from those two nearby nations. However, the islands in Melanesia are the least developed and poorest of Oceania. These countries have benefited the least from tourism and from subsidies from wealthy colonial and ex-colonial powers. Today, most Melanesians still live in remote villages that remain somewhat isolated from the modern economy. For Hawaii, the social welfare of the native people is problematic. The map shows the distribution of poverty in Oahu, Hawaii. The highest level of poverty are in the urban pockets around Honolulu in the southwest, as well in the western census tract, which have the highest number of native Hawaiians. Video question number 5. Please pause the video and answer the following. Explain why parts of the Oceania realm are poor, while other parts are better off economically. In your own words, using the text as a guide, be thorough and specific in your answer.